Welcome to the world of ECT. We are a small environmental charity and not-for-profit company set up in 2008 to help preserve, maintain continuity and champion long-term ecological field experiments across the UK. Now, you might think the aftermath of a financial crash is a terrible time to establish a new charity, and you may be right, but our founding trustees persevered, and here we are still 15 years later. So this is our broad vision as espoused in our 10-year corporate plan to 2030, which you can read about from our website if you're interested. And we believe that we are unique in the UK in being the only organisation, charitable or otherwise, solely dedicated to preserving and enhancing the UK's LTE resource. So you might reflect that in an age of plastic grass and short-termism, long-term thinking is needed more than ever for a secure future in terms of our biosphere. So what are we talking about exactly here? Well, LTEs are sites where true experimentation is undertaken, outdoors in the real world with controls and replica through the manipulation of key variables such as climate change simulation, for example. They're about establishing true cause and effect and understanding the change at the landscape scale in response to key drivers like, for example, grazing, climate change I've already mentioned. And they are important for several reasons listed here, but primarily because they are the only route to knowledge for some of the big ecological questions of our day with respect to long-term ecosystem health. There is no other way of answering certain questions in ecology other than by setting up and running a long-term ecological field experiment for a long period of time. So ECT has a national register of experiments, but we don't just accept any old experiments onto our national register. We are a serious scientific organisation, and we define long-term as a minimum of 6 years of continuous manipulations to date, or funding for manipulations at least 6 years into the future. And our national register now includes over 80 LTEs, long-term experiments, at these 4 different stages of the life cycle that you can see listed here. And we score our sites formally against 12 criteria before they're accepted. And one of the primary criteria we use is to make sure that these are used as research platforms, not just by the principal investigator who runs the experiment, but by ecologists and end users around the country. And many of our experiments are well used by multiple institutions, I'm glad to say. Network LTEs fall within 6 main experiment types, and they're focused mainly on vegetation change and soil health in response to these interventions that you see listed here, which some of which are natural and some of which are human interventions in terms of land management and restoration, for example. We have received registration applications in the past for bird colony experiments, but I'm sure at least some of you will certainly appreciate that it's very difficult to design a controlled replicated experiment outdoors involving birds or any other animals, large or small, that can move around freely. So we are focused on plants, certainly above ground, but below ground, soil health and soil microbiota and soil microbiology as well. So that's where the focus of our experiment types is. ECT currently has, of those 80 or so I mentioned on the register, 36 are currently active across 37 sites, different sites spread all over the UK. As you can see, we have experiments now on the register in all 4 home nations of the UK. This is the Hillsborough long-term slurry and nutrient addition experiment at the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute just south of Belfast, the one on its own out there. The grandfather of all experiments is this one here at Rothamsted, the park grass experiment, which I'll mention later. And that has been running for 167 years now. So these experiments cover a range of different habitats, from uplands and lowlands peat bog, for example, through grassland and woodland to coastal dune. And we have now a couple of very large scale, landscape scale freshwater catchment experiments on the register as well. So many of our LTEs are decades long, but a couple, the top two here, are over a century. And right down to the lowest, the youngest, Byford Face in Staffordshire, is just 6 years and just makes it onto our register in terms of its funding into the future. Grass, which you can see in the aerial photograph top right here, is the grandfather of them all at 167 years. Grassland experiment, Pallisley's also a grassland experiment, 127. But we have some milestones next year. The Ainsdale Dunes grazing experiment on dune slacks in West Lancs hits 50 years, so there'll be a celebration at that site next year, organised by, hopefully by us and Natural England. So to give you an idea of what it is we do on a day-to-day basis, here's a summary list of our key activities. This is the new raindrop drought and enhanced rainfall experiment at Wyton Woods, which ECT was instrumental in setting up with Oxford University back in 2016. So we do get involved in establishing new platforms as well as recruiting existing ones. These activities are funded through competitively won grants, mainly, as you'll see top right, from the Esme Fairbairn Foundation and the British Ecological Society, but also through private donations, and those remain our two main sources of income. I don't really have time to go through these activities in any great detail here with Kadmiel waiting in the wings to speak. So I'd just like to close my brief introduction to ECT by focusing on science communication activities in particular, and how we've pioneered, at least in the UK, we believe, the use of virtual reality to bring remote, difficult to access long-term experiments to life at any events that we either host or we attend. But if any of you come to a BES meeting or any meeting where we're present, come and find us, because we'll have our headsets with us and you can try them on. So the first rendering of an experiment in VR we did was the Buxton climate change experiment in Derbyshire, just outside the Peak District. This is shortly to become the world's longest running continuous climate change manipulation experiment next year. It has been the longest running in the UK for quite some time, but it's about to overtake an experiment in the US that has ceased treatments now. So this is a real part of the UK's scientific heritage now at 30 years. And what I'm going to show you is a short 2D video snapshot of what you can experience in these Oculus headsets that we make available. So hopefully my sound will share, and for about a minute you can see what we've done with VR at the Buxton site. with that, thank you for listening, everyone, and I'll close there. And it's my pleasure to hand back to you as chair, Keith.
Thank you, Ben. I'm going to hand straight over to Kadmiel so that we don't waste any time. So Kadmiel, share your slides and over to you.
Okay, great. Right, thanks, Keith. So that should be up there for you now. So yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm Kadmiel Maseyk. I'm a senior lecturer at the Open University in the School of Environment, Earth and Ecosystem Sciences. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a bit of a presentation first, just outlining some of the background to LTEs, the why we're interested in them, which Ben has already touched on a little bit, and highlight 4 LTEs that are on the ECT register. So yeah, in the background here, you can see another view of the raindrop experiment that ECT set up coming up to 8 years ago now. So where I'm also involved in as well, but I won't be talking so much about that one this evening. Okay, so what are some of the processes that we're interested in that necessitate the need for long-term ecological field experiments where we do these manipulations in the field? Well, there's a range, you know, atmospheric change. Of course, the atmosphere is changing, and this is driving a lot of other changes in particular in the climate system. There's land use changes. There's the different approaches we have to management in terms of grazing or nutrient application. Disturbance effects, either managed or unmanaged, and increasingly, in the area that's becoming of increasing importance, of course, is ecosystem restoration as well. And how do we get at understanding some of these, the ecological impacts of some of these changes? Well, one thing we can do is we can just monitor over time, and over time collect a lot of data that enables us to understand how things are changing in response to the changes that we're observing and all the other factors that are going on. But of course, it takes time to collect this data. We can make use of natural archives such as tree rings, which record a lot of information when the trees are growing, and they're laid down in the wood of the tree rings in terms of their composition and their width and various factors like that. We can do controlled experiments indoors, inside controlled environments, where we can manipulate specific factors and have quite tight control on what we're interested in inside these environments. Obviously, you are limited by the size of your experimental units, shall we say, in this case, but these can also be quite powerful for specific applications. Or we can do outdoor field manipulation experiments, where we go in natura, shall we say, and actually manipulate factors of interest and understand these in the context of all the other changes that are happening in the environment at the time. And that, of course, is the area we're interested in. And that image that you can see here is the Bifor face, the one that Ben mentioned, is one of the youngest ones on the register here, where it's free air CO2 enrichment experiment north of Birmingham. So yeah, what can we do with these long-term field manipulation experiments? Well, like all experiments, we can use them to test specific hypotheses, and it helps us develop a mechanistic understanding of the processes that are going on in the field, because through these and through the fact that we are manipulating one factor and understanding what the response is, or sometimes more than one, can be a combination of factors, and get an idea of how the system is changing in response to that manipulation. It helps us identify important points in that response, these responses, in terms of both the direction, the magnitude, and any sort of changes that might occur in inflection points, for example. And the important point is that we're looking at these changes in the context of the ecosystem as a whole. So it really helps us develop that holistic view of how ecosystems are going to be responding over time in the face of the changes that we're experiencing. So essentially what we're doing in terms of, if we're looking at global change processes, we're kind of accelerating that change to a specific point in the future, and looking at how the system is responding to those changes. And they also provide an important resource for questions that we might not have envisaged at the moment, or as with time new techniques come on, that we can utilize that we just don't necessarily envisage at the start of the experiment. And I'll highlight one of those towards the end of the talk this evening. And the other important point, of course, is that there are just important timescales involved in ecological dynamics that change over time depending on what we're looking at. And so this is just a sort of a schematic, really, just to show you the different types of processes that we may consider. This is related to a grassland system, for example, in particular this one here, which I've borrowed from Raj Whitlock from Liverpool. But it highlights how different processes come into play at different timescales and over time. So it's important to be able to understand this, and that's why we need to run these experiments for long periods. But like everything, they don't necessarily sit on their own. They're very powerful on their own, but they sit in that broader field where we draw information together from lab experimentation through our field experiments, and coupled with those long-term observations as well, where they are available. And I'll touch on this briefly right at the end as well. So it's important to recognize that, like all things in science, there's a much bigger picture that our work sits within. Okay, so yeah, as we mentioned, we're going to just touch on 4 quite pivotal long-term experiments that have been running in the UK here, one from each of the nations, from the 36 active experiments that are on the ECT register at the moment. There's quite a rich body of work going on in the UK in terms of long-term experimentation, that's for sure. So the first one is the Buxton Climate Change Impacts Lab up in Derbyshire. That's, as been mentioned, it's soon going to become the longest climate change impact experiment in the world, with the retirement at 30 years of one of the ones in the US. So yeah, this is a climate change experiment. And just for context, here are some of the latest sort of climate change predictions for the UK from the Met Office. So predictions out to 2070, for example, including the warming of both winters and summers. Winters getting wetter, but summers getting probably hotter and drier. And there's regional differences, of course, but there's these really important impacts on both temperature, which is a key driver for all biological processes, and of course water availability, which is fundamental to life. So here's well, the image you've seen already is what the site looks like. So it's an old ancient sheep pasture site. They don't graze there now, but they do cut to simulate the grazing at a point in time of the year. So yeah, as of next month, essentially, it'll become the world's longest running climate change experiment. Very species rich system on this grassland. And the treatments include drought, warming, and watering, and then combinations of the drought and warming, and the watering and warming. So the drought is imposed by those rain shelters, the automatic rain shelters that close over the plots when it rains, and these they close in between July and August to prevent rain. They close during the rain. If it rains in July and August, they'll close and prevent any water falling on those plots in that time. The heating is conducted by heating cables in the ground, raising the temperature by about 3 degrees over the winter period. And watering is through drip irrigation, which is done at the same time that the drought treatment is done. And of course, there are control plots, and then there's these combinations. And these are a randomized plot arrangement, which is shown in the schematic here up on the right. And each of the treatment plots, so each of these ones here is a 3 meter by 3 meter area, which can be extremely rich in diversity and indeed numbers of species present, as shown here. So this is what it looks like. So these, if you look closely, on the drought one, the shelters are in a mid position, because this is captured from a video when they're closing. So they actually shift up all the way up to, from this point, which is shown on the watering one here at the bottom point, up to the top point of that. So the actual treatment plot is just above there. The heated one is quite clearly highlighted after snow in the winter here. You can see the black areas where the snow has melted or not settled on the heated plots. And the wetted plots, the watered plots there are highlighted. You can see it in a period where it's particularly dry, the lusher vegetation on the watered plots. There's a number of aims of the experiments, but there's some 4 or 5 broad areas here that they address at this experiment, and there's extensive literature now that has come out from this site, of course, addressing some of these aims and goals of the research at the site, looking at the impacts of the climate change on resilience, species diversity, ecosystem structure, and how these, and then thinking about, of course, what the implications are of these changes, because a lot of the work we do through these experiments feed into policy and land management decisions. So here's an example of one set of the results from just one example from the site, showing the response to productivity of the different experiments and experimental treatments across there, from the control, the drought, the heating, in the combination of the heating and drought, the heating and wetting, and just the wetting alone. And you can see, for example, obviously a reduction in biomass with drought. Heating, slight reduction, but heating and drought tends to look like the droughting effect tends to dominate, and then heating and wetting pretty similar to the heating per se. And there are many other processes that can be looked at. Phenology is a very important process in all biological systems, and a key indicator of, in fact, of climate change processes, the shifts in phenology that we're observing. And so there's some work that's been done here by a couple of PhD students, I believe, looking at phenology of different flowers or flower groups in response to the warming or the precipitation, and how these are shifting in time in terms of their shift in days relative to the control, I believe. Because that's the now world famous, well, always was world famous, but now world leading Buxton climate change experiment. The next one is one relating to nitrogen manipulation. So this is on Wim Bog in the north and in the Scottish borders, looking at the impacts of nitrogen addition on important bog, heather-dominated bog system up there. And you can just see it. Many of these experiments, you can actually see them on Google Earth and the Google Earth imagery because of their scale now, including raindrop, for example, and Bifur Face, and this is the Wim Bog layout here. Just for scale, this area here up the middle, that's about 60 meters long, that one there. Okay, why nitrogen? So the nitrogen cycle is one of the cycles that humans are disrupting to quite a significant extent through a range of our different processes, in particular through agriculture, urban environments. These are all having an impact on the nitrogen cycle, and adding different forms of nitrogen to the atmosphere that are coming out both as dry deposition, forming as just this particulate, or wet deposition coming down in rain. And because nitrogen is such a key element for in particular plant productivity, that's why we use it in fertilizer. For example, this has consequent impacts on ecosystems. That extra nitrogen that's just getting out and is widespread in the environment now. So understanding the impacts of nitrogen is pretty key, because it's nitrogen loading on our systems is something that is going to continue into the future. So the treatments they do there at Wim Bog, there's different forms of nitrogen. So there's both ammonia, which is released as a gas, and that's sort of to simulate the dry deposition. It's released near the surface, and it's released in such a manner that you have a concentration gradient. I'll show you in a second. And then there's wet deposition treatments of either oxidized forms, sodium nitrate, or reduced form, ammonium chloride, nitrogen deposition. Yeah. And then there's also treatments in combination with potassium and phosphorus at 2 different nitrogen levels to compare these effects with and without other nutrients. So in total, there's about 44, I think, from memory, treatment combinations across the board in terms of the wet treatment plots. So this is the image you could see from the Google Earth view earlier. So the 2 wet deposition, the oxidized and the reduced forms on either side there, and within each of those there's a number of subplots with the different combinations that I mentioned, and then this ammonia transect going up the middle spine here, with quite a unique system that they have for ammonia release that's dependent on the wind conditions. That's controlled by the monitoring the wind speed and direction all the time with the sonic anemometer, and then this is released accordingly. So these, just going back, all these lines, or shall we say, this infrastructure that you can see here are boardwalks that out onto the plots, so to avoid obviously walking across the sensitive bog. And on some of these, you can see these posts, which has the system up here and highlighted here, which is for releasing the ammonia at certain points. And then as you get further away along that central spine of it, you get a decrease in ammonia concentration. So you get an idea of the effects of both deposition per se, but also the different concentration of ammonia on the system. And through that, they will look. Sorry about that little text there. That's from my template that sort of made its way through. I forgot about that. Look at the change in different percentage cover of different species, of course, to see how they're responding to the treatment. So this is just indicative of some of the data that has been collected from the site. So these are the different treatment levels and different species. And then over time, you can work out which are the species which are winning and which are losing in response to the treatments which are shown here. So we can understand how these bog ecosystems might change over time with ongoing nitrogen deposition of different forms. Okay, now we'll go over to the Plinlimmon research catchments. This is an area that really I find really interesting. This is in Wales. It's a long-term experiment. This has been running over 50 years as well now, I believe, actually. Yeah, so it's what we call a paired catchment study. So there's 2 catchments. It's the Severn and the Wye River, so the source of the Severn, I believe, and the Wye adjacent, where there's a range of monitoring sites that are shown in these purple or pink purple triangles on there to monitor to stream flow, but a whole lot of other parameters as well, particularly with time. And they're paired with 2 different land use treatments: conifer plantation and dwarf shrub heathland, and improved grassland, fertilized grassland. So yeah, so it started in 1967. Just repeating what I've said here, these 2 different land use. So the important, or the question really at the start, was how conifer forestry plantation was going to affect compared to the water catchments, compared to the graze moorland sites. It's become over time a very interdisciplinary site for interdisciplinary science. There's more data is collected through different from different fields, including water chemistry, groundwater studies, soil science, as you can see here. More instrumentation has been put on site, and so on, and highlighting the advantage of running things long term and being able to put the data you're collected into context with the other changes that have been observed. And here's just some nice pictures, because I like to, it's nice to sometimes look at some of the historical photos as well in context of some things change and some things don't. Maybe the instrumentation has changed a bit in terms of that Met station, for example, but there's been this consistency of measurement and data collection through time. So yeah, one of the main questions addressed at that site is, do trees intercept more water than the short grass system? Yes, the answer is yes in this case, but of course, like many things, the answer is a bit more nuanced and a bit more complex. So not only do the trees intercept more, and maybe evaporation is increased with the plantation, but it also depends on the age of the plantation, and so the younger ones are intercepting and evaporating a bit more than as they get a bit older, it seems from this data shown here. But then of course there are the other management considerations that come into it as well, for when the trees are felled, it's a plantation forest and so on. So there's impacts as well that need to be considered. And they extend this to look into what are the implications for water resources, such as the erosion and stream sediment. And you can see the difference between the blue and the red bars there being the forest and the grassland, or the moorland catchments respectively here, showing the different, much larger loads within the forest and catchment. Okay, and the final one is the Hillsborough nutrient fertilization experiment. And this is another visionary experiment in my mind, actually conceived right back in the 1960s, when agriculture was getting a bit more intensive and new systems were being brought online, and there was these concerns about the long-term effects of the application of liquid manures on soil quality, grassland yield, silage quality, all the factors that are important, of course, for farmland management, as well as the biological botanical composition. So yeah, the actual treatment started in 1970 on a perennial ryegrass, and another world leader. It's the only experiment in the world now that is running long-term experiment on liquid manure applications. So yeah, you can see how increasingly valuable these experiments become as you keep them running. So this site involves 8 nutrient treatments. Obviously the control, then a synthetic nutrient fertilizer application, NPK fertilizer, then 3 levels of pig liquid manure and 3 levels of cattle liquid manure application at the site. And one of the interesting points about this experiment is, I think, is that it shows, as well as the information that it's been generating, it highlights a couple of the points I mentioned earlier on about the value of running experiments long term. So at the time the experiment was set up, the role of soil for soil and carbon sequestration was probably not forefront. It was one of the primary hypotheses they were interested in testing, but of course with time, and particularly with the greater understanding of climate change and climate feedbacks, and the role that long-term carbon sequestration has in terms of understanding within the carbon climate feedback system, shall we say, they were able to go back and revisit archived soil samples to analyze these for soil carbon, and look at the rates of soil carbon sequestration in response to the different fertilizer applications over time, and which is shown in this figure that was recently published from the site, and that the different colored dots are the different treatments. This is the control, and the NF is the fertilizer, then the C is for the cow, and the P is for the pig, and LMH is low, medium, and high, these different concentrations. So they're all in there, showing that there's this increase in carbon sequestration over time. But this is much higher in what I the yellow one here, which is the high cow liquid manure application, for example. And at the same time, they are able to test various models that we have for describing these processes, because, of course, one of the important purposes of these long-term experiments is to get data that we can use to inform and develop and improve models to of the functioning of the biosphere in response to change in management decisions. So you can see there's certainly some improvement that's required on these models, but overall the dynamics and the direction and the change is being captured by these models as well that is shown here. So I think that's really quite an important feature that's highlighted from this site. Okay, I'll just wrap up with a couple of final points or things I've been sort of thinking about recently. So one of the questions you might have is, well, how well do these experiments, how useful are they? Do they really match what we might see over the long term? And here's an example from a study from Knapp et al. Published a few years ago, looking, and this is from grassland sites, showing how the response in above ground net primary productivity, so you can basically think about how much grass or biomass is produced above ground in the season in these grassland sites in response to the change in growing season precipitation. So this has come from where they've been able to, there are a number of sites where there are these long-term observation records where they've had the so decadal length. Also, we've got the natural variation in rainfall that can be observed relative to the long-term mean, and looking at how productivity is responding in response to these natural variations, and also though compare these to those that have derived from the experimental manipulations. And there are two important points here. One is that they tend to overlap very well, giving a lot of confidence in the results that are coming out of the experimental systems. And but the second one is that the experimental systems are not capturing what's happening in the sort of the lower and the higher extremes of the natural variation. So we might be missing some of the experimental systems might not quite be capturing some of the extremes in variability that are occurring naturally. So that has implications for extending out or modeling the system under the extreme ones if we extrapolate from our experimental systems. So thinking about going forward and how future long-term experiments might look like, one of the challenges that we are faced with field manipulation experiments is the issue of scale. You'll see, for example, the Buxton climate change experiment, they were 3 meter by 3 meter plots. At raindrop, we use 5 meter by 5 meter plots. And in the future, I think we're going to see even larger systems due to the fact that with things like increased automation and the ability to automate the control in terms of things like drought enclosures and opening and closing systems for heating control, warming, passive warming, and things like that, that will lend itself to potentially larger scale experiments, such as this one that's in Germany, where there are plots, 400 meter square plots. Well, that's not each experimental plot, but 16 by 24 meter plots or something like that, I think they were. Replicated for different farming systems and grassland types, so organic and conventional farming and intensive and extensive pasture farming. That this experiment is set up to address. And then the other issue I think that is going to become more important in future long-term experiments relates back to the figure I just showed you from that grassland analysis, is capturing extreme events. We're probably becoming more aware of the importance of extreme events through things like heat waves and so on, and also flooding, for example. But if some of the predictions bear out, and then we're going to have a shift in obviously the mean of a particular climate variable, for example, and also therefore as well as increasing variability, the role that extreme events play are going to become more important, and how they impact ecosystems is going to become an issue that we will need to address. Okay, so just to summarize, long-term field manipulation experiments are really one of our key tools for understanding global change and management, and the impacts that these have on the ecological impacts of these processes. The scales are a challenge, and incorporating multi-factor interactions is also another feature that's going to become more prevalent, I believe. That just adds to this challenge, but the technology is developing with time as well, so we will be able to meet these challenges, I'm sure. And yeah, it's important to remember that the experimental results need to be collected together with observations and models for a complete understanding of how our biosphere is going to be responding, and will respond in the future as we go forward.